All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Radical Public Health, Housing Justice, and Public Health panel. My name is Diana. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a member of the Radical Public Health COVID-19 Committee, which is the committee that helped organize this event for all of you tonight. We have a lot of great discussions ahead of us, so I will just jump right in and get us started with a brief outline of our event. We will begin our event with a land acknowledgement, an overview of our sponsoring organizations, as well as an overview of our community guidelines. I will then pass it over to our fellow Radical Public Health member, Henry, who will provide a brief background on the topic of evictions in public health, help introduce our panelists, and moderate the panel. Once we have completed our panel session, we will allow time for a Q&A so that folks in the audience can ask their questions, and then we will conclude the event. We would first like to acknowledge that the University of Illinois at Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the three Fire peoples. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support Indigenous community struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. We also want to take this time to acknowledge all of the UIC School of Public Health student organizations who helped organize and sponsor this event, including Radical Public Health, Minority Students for the Advancement of Public Health, and the Public Health Student Association. And here are our community guidelines for our event tonight. The purpose of these community guidelines is to make sure that we provide a safe space for everyone to share their ideas, learn from one another, and have discussions in a respectful, open-minded, and supportive manner. So as a friendly reminder, please keep yourself muted during the event unless you're asking a question during the Q&A portion of the session. Also, just as a heads up, we will be discussing sensitive topics during the event, so please be prepared to be uncomfortable and be prepared to engage in self-care if you need it. When sharing ideas or talking with others, please refrain from tone policing. When asking questions or engaging with panelists during the event, we do recommend that you turn your video on. However, please do not feel the need to turn your camera or microphone on if you do not want to. You are also more than welcome to type your comments or questions in the chat instead. Our goal today during today's panel is to make sure that everyone feels as comfortable as possible, so please let us know if there's anything that we can do to help with that. It is also very important for all of us to listen with love and use active and humble listening when discussing our ideas. Please remember to challenge the idea and not the person, and since this is a space in which we're all learning together, please be open to making mistakes. Lastly, if there is something that is mentioned during the panel that you need further clarification on or need repeated, please feel free to signal that in the chat and we can let our panelists know. Our fellow Radical Public Health member, Marjorie, will also be monitoring the chat, so if you need any help or have any questions, please feel free to reach out to her as well as myself, and we will be more than happy to help you. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed today's panel, and without further ado, I will now pass it off to Henry.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you to everyone who has logged in today. We have a great crowd, it looks like. I am very much looking forward to our conversation. My name is Henry, and I use he, him pronouns, and I'll be moderating the panel today. Before we begin, I want to briefly provide some background on the topic of evictions in public health. This topic is incredibly important for several reasons. Of course, from the perspective of COVID-19, we have seen severe increases in housing instability and an eviction crisis looming as the eviction moratorium in Illinois has ended. However, like so many of the issues we face, the eviction crisis is not a new one, especially for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, along with undocumented immigrants and those who identify as transgender and or non-binary. Next slide. The impacts that evictions have on health are significant in so many important areas. They have been linked to increased incidence of adverse birth outcomes, including low birth weight, prematurity, and infant mortality. They also contribute to higher all-cause mortality and significantly worse reported mental health among adults. Children who experience evictions have a higher prevalence of food insecurity and worse educational outcomes compared to other low-income children living in rental housing. It has even been found that those who have been evicted are more likely to experience homelessness and stay in shelters longer than those who have not been evicted. Evictions are devastating to human life and dignity and are rooted in systemic and structural racism. Our panel of amazing individuals will be discussing the health impacts of evictions and housing instability, as well as their continued work and dedication to those facing these issues. Next slide. Our panel today includes Stephanie Salgado and Latham Zierfas, organizers with McKinley Park Mutual Aid, Aileen Flanagan, Senior Supervising Attorney with the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing, Sandy Godinez, the Community Relations and Intake Coordinator for the Harbour, and Annie Howard, the Chicago Housing Justice League Equity and Operations Organizer. I want to thank them all so much for being here. And I just would like to first begin by inviting Stephanie and Latham to introduce themselves and their organization.
Thanks, Henry. I can get us started, Latham. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Salgado. My pronouns are she, her, and I am an organizer with McKinley Park Mutual Aid. And I know some of you might know that I'm also a second-year MPH candidate in the Division of Community Health Sciences. But today I'm here representing McKinley Park Mutual Aid. So a little bit about us. We are a grassroots group of community members out of McKinley Park, which, if you don't know, is a neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago. And we formed at the beginning of the pandemic as a kind of response to the urgent and really immediate needs of our neighbors who were dealing with not only COVID, but really the amplified effects of capitalism, racism, and a bunch of other systems of oppression. And we're self-organized and directed, and we're non-hierarchical, which means that we make decisions collectively and we don't really have a set leader. Our work is really centered on the idea that we should care and rely on each other in a reciprocal way, as opposed to relying on social safety nets that often work in a top-down approach and don't really meet folks' immediate needs or just fail people completely. And so essentially this looks like supporting our neighbors with material, structural, and often emotional support. So that means that we help people with rent, with bills, with groceries, clothes, furniture, you name it. We've shared a ton of resources on vaccines. And so we get all sorts of requests. We also do a lot of advocacy work through cross-movement building with supporting campaigns like Black Lives Matter, defunding CPD, ending money bail, and we frequently organize with other grassroots groups in our neighborhood, like Neighbors for Environmental Justice and the 12th Ward IPO on food and environmental justice issues. And so we're trying to do a little bit more of this kind of big picture work, but I will actually pass it over to Latham to kind of talk about that a little bit more. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I'm Latham. I use he and they pronouns, and I'm also with McKinley Park Mutual Aid. That was such a beautiful introduction, Steph. Yeah, we are, I think we, like a lot of mutual aid groups, formed right at the beginning of the pandemic, and didn't really have any expectations, but found ourselves still together and wanting to continue to engage. And also, like, we've been able to be somewhat impactful in the year and some change we've been organizing together. So we are now in a position where we are have been approached with some potential funding support. We've also done some other projects like a community garden, things like this. So now we are looking to the future, and one of the things we're starting to explore, which really aligns with tonight's conversation, is how we might be able to own property in this neighborhood and use it in a way to that's cooperative, that sort of creates more housing security and accessibility in the neighborhood, especially as we know, the housing market is really, really wild right now. And also, there's this weird, a lot of folks are leaving Chicago, but then also there's this gentrification and housing shortage. It's all really weird and messy. So we'd like to figure out how we can create ongoing systems of support. So one of the things we're thinking about or trying to make moves towards is purchasing property and figuring out maybe either a land trust or some combination of a land trust and a cooperative ownership model. We don't know a lot about this stuff. So I also am saying this for two reasons. One, to let you know about what we're working on, and also two, to plant the seed so that we might be able to ask for some of these, some of the smarties in this room to help us make some of this stuff happen. So yeah. And the last thing I'll say is that in terms of our future looking work, is we are also interested in bringing back a garden that we had last summer and using that as a way to sort of share food in the neighborhood. So thinking creatively as well. Yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Henry.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. That was such a great introduction to that. Next up, we're going to have Aileen from Lawyers Committee for Better Housing.
Hi, good evening. I'm Aileen Flanagan. She, her is my pronoun, and I'm from the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. That was a beautiful description of what you guys do, and what a beautiful concept. I love these community grassroots organizations, and the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing is committed to working with those groups all throughout Chicago to try to improve people's lives through their housing. So it's great to meet you all tonight. I've been invited to talk about evictions and how that is relating to people's livelihood, people's health outcomes. And the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing has been advancing the rights of people to live without discrimination in affordable housing with for many years. Since the 1980s, we've been advocating for renters in Chicago. We do this through eviction defense work, building court work. We do community outreach and community education. And we also have a supportive services unit that tries to help people, and currently assisting people with rental assistance applications. So that's kind of an overview of what Lawyers Committee for Better Housing does. And I'd like to touch on real quickly the definition of evictions that we're using tonight, because I think it's important to understand that evictions, it's a legal kind of operation. So it's a process by which people can be removed from their housing through a legal process. But there are other ways that people are evicted. People lose their housing a lot because they're terrified to stay because of threatened evictions, because we all know that evictions themselves, to have something like that on your record, can be so devastating to your credit and your ability to rent in the future, that sometimes just the threat of evictions will cause people to self-evict. Sometimes people are evicted because their housing conditions are so severe and buildings are so poorly managed and maintained that people have no choice but to move out. And then some people are evicted because their landlords choose not to proceed through the legal process and simply come and make the property so uninhabitable that they can't stay by like I was referring to, not providing decent habitable housing, but also by actually locking people out, changing doors, changing locks, and depriving people of access to their housing. So there's a couple of ways people lose their housing, and all of them are traumatic for different reasons, but they are very traumatic as we all understand, and we know that can impact people's health outcomes. I don't want to spend too much time, but I want to kind of give a framework of the eviction process, that it is a legal process. It starts with a written notice from a landlord to notify the tenant that for some reason or for no reason, they're going to be proceeding on a path to evict that person and have them move out of their home. And like I say, sometimes at that juncture, people just move out and self-evict because they're so afraid of the consequences of the legal process. That notice does not have to be notarized. It doesn't have to be part of a legal process to accomplish what they're attempting to accomplish, and that is to start the legal process of going to eviction court. The next step is to file an eviction case. Once an eviction case is filed, the landlord then needs to have the tenant properly served a summons to notify the tenant of how they can go to court and defend their housing if they choose to. The next step is to go to court, which is a traumatic event in and of itself. And then if the tenant is successful, then the case is dismissed. But if the tenant is not successful in their trial, then the court orders an eviction. That order is a piece of paper that the landlord is required to present to the sheriff. And the sheriff then takes that order and then executes, that's what we call the execute that eviction order by appearing at the property and supervising the change of locks. So that is what a legal process called eviction looks like, kind of from a real sort of quick summary. It's great to be here tonight, and I look forward to hearing from everyone. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you so much, Aileen. That was a great overview of the process. I hope everyone thought that was really helpful for the context of this panel. So next up we have Sandy. I'll have you go next.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much, Henry, for the invitation. Like Henry said, my name is Sandy Godinez. I'm the Community Relations and Intake Coordinator for the Harbour. My pronouns are she, her. So I was basically invited to talk about the work that we do at the Harbour, serving youth and young adults that are experiencing homelessness already. So by the time they get to the Harbour, they're already in some sort of housing instability. So the Harbour has been around for 50 years, and we are in the northwest suburbs. There used to be this myth that homelessness doesn't exist in the suburbs, but it does look a little bit different than the city homelessness that the youth experience. And so a lot of it is just like couch surfing, staying at friends and relatives until they're no longer welcomed. So our services, we basically provide emergency shelter, and we have a shelter that is in Des Plaines. And then we have transitional housing that's kind of scattered throughout the northwest suburbs. We actually have 2 houses where we serve youth in a congregate setting. And so they have the ability of living there for up to 9 months with the goal of transitioning into their own apartments. And then we also have a pregnant and parenting program, which is where we serve them in their own apartments. So a lot of what I was hearing about wrongful evictions, we've actually dealt with that way before COVID, just because of how young some of our clients are. They're unaware of, their rights. So our case managers have actually, been advocates for them way before the pandemic. But when the pandemic hit, that's really when our work, was really in reaching out to those youth that needed our help, especially with, paying their rents if they were behind. A lot of our youth, lost their jobs, or if they had children where then they had to stay at home, and, the children were in school. So we just try to help them navigate through all of that. But that's just a little bit about the services. I'll get into more of that when the panel questions start, but that's just a little bit about what the Harbour does.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sandy. It's good to have someone who's out of the city of Chicago talk about your experience. So thank you very much for being here. And finally, we're going to finish off with Annie. Annie's again with the Chicago Housing Justice League. We'll share she has some slides that we'll share.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just cause for eviction, which is a policy that would make a lot of people's lives in Chicago better. I'll just get going on things. So I'm going to be talking first about a building that's in Bronzeville at 43rd and King Drive. There are renters in that building who are currently dealing with no fault eviction. There is, go to the next slide, please. So this is Robert Brigg. He has been in his home for about 41 years. And right now, him and his neighbors are being asked to move out of their homes, even though they've done nothing wrong. Brigg and his neighbors are dealing with a no-fault eviction. And many of them are seniors, many of them are disabled and living on fixed incomes. And needless to say, when you're in that kind of situation and you don't expect to move because you've been current on your rent and you're not causing disruptions in the building, an eviction on short notice can be really traumatizing and just very challenging to navigate. And so Brigg and his neighbors, who again, people have been living there, people spoke at this press conference a few weeks ago, have been living there 27 years, 35 years, 41 years, are now all of a sudden being asked to move. And while some of the neighbors are still in the building and fighting to stay there, a lot have already moved out of the unit. As Eileen was describing, there's just that sort of immediate fear that happens when you get an eviction notice and you end up moving more quickly than you necessarily need to. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this is a photograph from inside one of the units in the building. There was a reporter who was writing about this issue, and right when they went inside to the apartment to check out one of the units, the person's ceiling caved in and scattered debris all over their bathroom. And so at the same time as we're seeing a new ownership company come in and try and take the building and sell it, or excuse me, not sell it, but force the tenants out for new renters, you also see this sort of physical neglect in the property that's been there for years and years. And these two things are very tied together, both displacement and disrepair of units is very common in conjunction. And needless to say, these have very serious health impacts for the people living in these conditions, both in if they're living with this kind of disrepair, but also if they're living with the fear and distress of being asked to move despite having done nothing wrong. So if you go to the next slide, please. And so this example at 43rd and King Drive is just one very small example of why our coalition, the Chicago Housing Justice League, which is a group of housing organizations in Chicago, are fighting for the Just Cause for Eviction bill. Just Cause is a keystone tenant protection that would keep an estimated 10,000 Chicago households from unnecessary displacement each year. We know very clearly why these kinds of evictions are happening. In the case of the building in Bronzeville, it's very obviously trying to flip the building for more money and to gentrify the neighborhood more generally. We know that in many cases, an eviction is masking illegal discrimination. And we also know that evictions are used to mask illegal retaliation. If a renter is complaining about unsafe living conditions and a landlord doesn't want to fix them, they'll often use the eviction process to get a tenant to move out. This kind of situation is untenable. Unfortunately, as in our current situation, it's often more profitable for a landlord to ask a tenant to move through the eviction process. I say ask, they're not being asked. They're being forced to move out of their homes through the eviction process. And that's more profitable than letting a tenant live in their home and have that security. Often we know that this leads to people being doubled up or living on the streets. In many cases nowadays, it's so hard to find affordable housing that the possibility of just moving to another unit, when you factor in all of the moving costs, it just doesn't really work out for a lot of people. And so this is why we're fighting for this bill and kind of why I'm here to talk about things today. Next slide. So just a few basics about the bill and why the context that we're working in. We have about 1.4 million renters and about 600,000 units in Chicago, which is more than half of the city's population. There are about 24,000 eviction court cases filed in Chicago each year. This is obviously a very racially skewed issue. The top 10 community areas with eviction rates are African-American communities. And then you would also see in a lot of Latinx neighborhoods, these sort of invisible evictions in many cases, because you'll have landlords calling and saying that they're gonna report a tenant to ICE or the police if they don't move out immediately. We estimate, and this is based on the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing and their data, that about 20 to 25% of eviction court cases are no fault, meaning the tenant has done nothing wrong. And then when you also add in, again, those invisible evictions where people get out before they get to the eviction court, we actually think it's about 10,000 people.
Oh no, it looks like we may have lost Annie. Can hold on just for a second, see if she comes back. The downsides of doing anything on Zoom, as we all know. Okay, so looks like she will probably have to rejoin. I encourage everyone to look at this slide, of course, and you can read it. And if she needs to, she can have time to, we can revisit this if we need to. Let's go to the next slide and see what I think we're almost done.
I can just say too that if you go to the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing, lcbh.org, you can see this data portal on our website and have access to these data that have been collected for years to create a really interactive and fascinating discussion about evictions in Chicago. I encourage everybody to go to that website and take a look at what Annie is describing here, because it's pretty, there's a lot of information on that data portal.
Thanks, Eileen. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And once again, we should be able to come back to this later. I know this is a big reason why she's here on this panel and really wants to promote Just Cause. There's some other resources here that she has posted, and we can post that in the chat later down the road.
I'm sorry, will you guys make this presentation available too? Do you think you can?
I think we probably can.
Yep, we can. And it looks like Annie's back as well now.
Oh, yay.
Yes, I will rush
Okay.
through my last 2 slides. I promise I'll be quick, if that's okay.
No, you're completely fine. Don't worry.
Okay. So next slide, please. I'm almost done anyways. So yeah, so just a few more basics about Just Cause, and we'll talk about it more during the panel. It's already in place across the whole country in a number of whole states like California, New Jersey, cities like St. Paul, Philly, and Seattle, as well as all of the federally subsidized units, which is about 30,000 in Chicago. And so 10 million units of housing in the whole country have Just Cause already, or at least something like it. The very basic concept of Just Cause in Chicago, we're trying to create a list of reasons for an eviction to be filed. 3 of them are tenant fault, which are traditional things like non-payment of rent, disruption to neighbors, or damage to property, and refusing to renew a lease on similar terms. And then 4 are sort of landlord side things that we think are legitimate, which would be wanting to convert to condo, substantially rehab the unit, move themselves or a family member in, or remove it from the marketplace entirely. And in the latter 4 conditions, we would make sure that tenants would be getting relocation assistance. And so again, we know that the biggest problem with an eviction, especially if you're not expecting it, is you don't have money to move, or you're not expecting that. It's an expense that is pretty daunting for a lot of people. And so Just Cause would make sure that people that are being asked to move for no fault would be able to land on their feet more effectively. So we'll talk more about the bill later on, but that's the very basics of what we're working on. Next slide, please. So just a very little bit about what you can do if you're hoping to learn more about Just Cause from today. We have our petition, which I'll also put in the chat in a moment. If you sign on to our petition, I also send out a lot of emails about things that we're doing and ways that we're kind of continuing to organize for the bill. I'll talk a little bit more about the politics as well in a moment, but that will give you the most up-to-date information about what we're doing. And then we also have our website, justcausechicago.org. Yeah, I'll pause there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie, and glad to have you back. All right. Well, thank you everyone for those amazing introductions. So we'll get started now with the first question. I'm going to direct this specifically to Sandy to start off, and then we can go from there. And so that first question is, and I'll put it in the chat as well, just so you all have it, just in case. How does the process or outcome of eviction, homelessness, housing instability, in your experience, affect people's physical and mental health?
Yeah, really great question. There's a lot that goes into that. But basically, so from my experience at the Harbour, I did work as a youth development specialist at the shelter before actually transitioning into this position. So I had that one-on-one with the youth and young adults coming into the shelter. So I'll say that pretty much a majority of our youth that come already have some sort of, trauma that they bring with them, right? So they already are experiencing either depression or anxiety. So what it does is it really amplifies, right? Coming into a shelter setting is not easy. We try to make it, as low barrier as possible, not asking too many questions during intake, so that we understand, they're just in need of emergency shelter. They need a safe place for the night. So not putting up too many barriers. But it's scary, you don't know what to expect at a shelter. Even though the setting of our shelter is this nice big home, we only have 10 beds, that's our capacity. And it's a shared living space, but everyone gets their bedding and it's a nice homey setting. We try to make it as homey as possible, but it's not home, right? So you don't know what to expect. So for a lot of them, that fear, anxiety, depression, all of those things just get amplified by being in that setting. So we really have to be trauma focused and understanding, what is it that they come with already and meeting them where they're at, right? So we will see substance use, but understanding that that may be the way that they're coping with whatever they're going through. And we're not there to judge, we're just there to provide a safe place for them.
Thanks, Sandy. Does anyone else want to comment?
Well, first of all, can panelists ask questions as well? Because I have a question for Annie, but I don't know if I should hold it off to the end. I don't want to derail the conversation.
That's actually a great question. I think if it's relative to the specific question that we're talking about, go ahead and you can. I want this to be a conversation. If she brings something up and you want to ask that question when she's going, and then to continue starting that conversation, I'd say, yeah, go for it.
I'll hold off because it's not related, but yeah, we can just continue. But I do have something to add about this question about how does it impact safety and well-being. To Sandy's point, like folks are already dealing with health issues before they were dealing with housing instability, and so when you're having to think about how to not only just make rent, but also like a lot of the folks that we've interacted with in our neighborhood, how to put food on the table, how to get your kids to school, how to keep a job, that just adds to the amount of stress that people are already going to. And it kind of makes it impossible to even take care of yourself first. I can think of one person who had reached out to us and said that she had been rescheduling doctor's appointments for over a year because she just didn't have the time or capacity to even think about how to take care of herself first. And so it was kind of like this combination of worrying about how to make rent and then also how to take care of her family.
That's a really good point, Stephanie. I'm sorry, I wanted to jump in, but I actually had a young lady reach out to me recently for our pregnant and parenting program. And that was the issue she ran into, is that she did have a job before COVID, but then her son was in school. So she literally had to leave her job because they wouldn't accommodate her working remotely. She could work remotely. She was able to if they provided her with the laptop, but they weren't willing to accommodate her. And the son was in school. So it's like, well, do you neglect your son, from being in school and being there, providing that childcare? You can't just leave your son alone at home, right? Because then that could be a DCFS call. And then you're getting that's a whole nother rabbit hole you're going into, right? So it's like, what do you do? So she found herself in a situation where she had to leave her job and find something else part-time so that she could still provide food and housing for her son.
I have to say that I hear these stories like every day with clients that come to us and they're in the eviction process. And the stress is enormous that people are, because they're trying to deal with this biggest problem, plus all the rest of the problems in their life. But one of the things I think that people don't realize is how quickly eviction court works. That it's not like traditional court cases that you hear about going on for a year or so. These cases last a very short time. Tenants are given a summons, they come to court, and in some cases, at least before a new program was introduced, post-COVID, we have a new program called the eviction resolution program that tries to help, or the early resolution program that tries to help people be in a position to sort of resolve the case before they go to trial. But before that, people could easily find themselves in trial the first time they go to court. And a trial in an eviction case can last a very short time, like minutes, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And oftentimes tenants feel that they haven't had a chance to speak. That in itself is so traumatizing. But to try to solve these problems in that kind of condensed time frame is incredibly stressful and very, very difficult. And so as we talk about all of these impinging factors, just the court interaction, just that piece of it is enormously stressful. So it's a very heartbreaking place to find people who have all of these other, like, tertiary problems in their lives, to try to find themselves also in eviction court dealing with that. So we have many problems that people come to us with medical conditions that are exacerbated by their housing. I had one lady the other day who explained to me that her daughter could not get necessary heart surgery, that Loyola actually refused to perform the surgery because of the conditions of the apartment that they were living with were so severe that the risk of infection was so high that the medical provider would not agree to provide the service, which is just shocking to me, that it was so severe that the medical provider couldn't provide the service. So just wanted to offer that.
Eileen, I think that's a good point about not only do folks need housing, but they need healthy housing as well. So just having somewhere to live. Just thinking back about the pictures that Annie was showing with that person who's living in these horrible conditions, that can also really exacerbate people's mental well-being and just health as well.
So does anyone else want to comment on that specific topic? Stephanie, if you would like to ask your question to Annie, if you want to engage, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do have other questions though, if you would like me to just continue.
I would say just continue and then I can hold off to the end. Thanks.
Okay. We've touched on this a little bit, but I do still want to kind of especially highlight, for those of you who work with children and families, how does this eviction and housing instability affect their health specifically? And I think we did have a question from someone who's attending regarding homelessness and housing insecurity among pregnant and postpartum people and families with young children. And so how does the eviction process and housing instability, how does that impact them specifically?
Okay, I'm going to jump in again. So that actually that person that I was talking about, that neighbor, is actually a young mother, and she had been dealing with health issues, or I think it was like hypertension related to her postpartum period. And so because she was dealing with the issue of trying to make rent, and then also trying to find her kids childcare during the day so that she could work. She ended up having I'm not exactly sure what the medical term is, but it's called a pre-stroke. And it was pretty shocking to hear that, because she's a young mom of, I believe she's only 21 years old. So to hear someone at such a young age already dealing with such serious health consequences was pretty shocking. And, for those of us that are in public health, it's, sometimes you can't really kind of make that connection between what caused something, but I would say it's not a far reach to say that what she was going through with her housing instability definitely contributed to to what happened to her and her hospitalization.
And I would add that children are impacted by these unhealthy environmental hazards like lead and mold. Children have the incidence of asthma is extremely high in children who are living in these substandard conditions in poverty, and oftentimes leads to lifetime respiratory issues. Then children who are exposed to infestation of pests are also at higher risk for asthma and become much sicker as a result. And children who are exposed to lead, of course, have lead poisoning, which leads to disabilities that are lifelong. So the impact of substandard housing on children is intense. The substandard housing, I hate to like to draw these connections, but that is eviction, right? I mean, in a way, it's that kind of eviction that we were talking about. I think Annie mentioned it's that invisible eviction, which is a great way to frame it, because it is. It's like, well, that's not on, it's not a case, but it is at any rate extremely, if parents can even get out, if they can even move, it is a very devastating experience to be uprooted. But when they can't even move because these other impending pressures, it's even more stressful because the family knows that they're caught in this trap of living in this substandard environment. I'd like to answer Madeline's question, who asked at what point in the legal process does eviction show up on someone's credit? And that's a really important question because it goes to a ceiling initiative that we've recently passed as a result of the moratorium. It finally became clear that this was such a devastating process to people for a very long time, simply because they were unable to pay rent or unable to move out after receiving one of these no-fault eviction notices that it has a devastating consequence to someone's record. So the answer to that was that currently we have a ceiling statute that requires that all cases currently being filed need to be filed under seal. So that great news is that at least it doesn't hit the person's record the minute it's filed. Used to be that as soon as that case was filed, it became part of the public record. It was collected and called by landlord-tenant credit reporting agencies to be included on someone's record, and then it's never going to go off of their record. Some people think it disappears in 7 years, but it never does. It just stays part of the record. But since the ceiling measure was passed to improve and expand the ceiling remedy for renters, at least these eviction cases are sealed at the time that they're filed. They can be unsealed if there is an adverse finding, an adverse ruling, like a judgment in eviction order, or because these cases that are filed can be filed as joint actions, meaning they're filed for possession, but they're also filed for money. A money judgment is entered. So the person might move out, but that money judgment could still be entered against them. And if there is either of that kind of judgment, then the court may open the record back up. So I think that these cases there's some vulnerability there to it being open. And I don't know when that would happen. It can happen at the time the judgment is entered if the plaintiff landlord asks the court to unseal the record, or at some time in the future. The good news is, though, that right now, up until August, anybody with an eviction record should consider trying to get that record sealed, because there is a period of time right now where there's a look back and people can have those records sealed. Now, there are standards that that make it easier or harder, depending on how that case was resolved in court. You can go to Rentervention, which is an online chat that you can go to, and they can help you to determine what kind of case you have and whether or not you can have it sealed and go forward on a sealing remedy. So please, if anyone knows of anyone that is being tortured by these records, please follow up on that, because there are remedies right now to it that we haven't had in the past. So I don't know if I should go through and answer the other questions that are popping up, Henry, or if you want to just direct those answers.
I figure that I'm keeping track of them, and so we can bring them up at the end just to make sure that we do capture everyone's questions. I did want to ask, so one of the questions we got was, how do we get public officials in high need areas to support legislation to support safe and adequate and affordable housing? Not sure if any of you are comfortable with answering that question, but feel free. I'm not directing it to anyone specifically.
Can you say it one more time, Henry?
Sorry, yeah. So how do we get public officials in high need areas to support legislation that supports safe, adequate, and affordable housing? I'll put it in the chat.
I would love to jump in and talk a little bit about the politics of just cause, because it's been quite a process. And I think it's instructive of just how I think housing does not get enough attention in terms of policy. I think it's hard for, I don't know, the media doesn't want to talk about it. I think police reform is vitally important, and I think that gets a lot more media attention. And then anyways, but I wanted to, so Just Cause, we've been working on for the last 2+ years. We originally thought we were negotiating with the mayor's office. And then the mayor had said publicly that she wanted a just cause for eviction ordinance. Well, it was later revealed that she wasn't actually that clear in what she was talking about. And kind of what she was hoping for was what was passed last year, which was a fair notice bill, which would essentially expand the amount of time that a tenant has in terms of when they're told that they need to be moving out, depending on how long they've been living somewhere, which is not a bad thing. We're happy that that got passed, but it definitely does not go far enough. And so basically, since COVID started, our whole coalition has been having to go basically alderperson to alderperson to try and set up meetings to get the bill passed. It is really a very slow process, especially when you have 50 people in city council. It's an incredibly frustrating process, and you hear a lot of, I think, built-in anti-renter bias in city council. I mean, that makes sense, right? When a lot of money coming into the council is from developers and landlords and all of that. And so you'll hear things like, don't renters already have enough rights? Or, oh, they've gotten so spoiled during the pandemic by not having to pay rent. And that's just happening to everybody. You know, that kind of very false notion that I think a lot of our policymakers have is so deeply ingrained, even amongst some policymakers who you think should be on our side. I'm not going to name names, but it's been frustrating being in some meetings where it's just like, why are we talking like this? This is unbelievable. I think despite all of that, I think we're getting hopefully close to our bill getting through city council. As of now, we have about 14 co-sponsors, which is only a little over half of what we need to get 26 votes, but we've got some big meetings coming soon. But yeah, I think just really getting through on public messaging on why renters need more rights, why, you know, I think when I talk to people and tell them why Just Cause needs to exist, they say to me, like, is that really not already the case that a renter that's current on their rent is not allowed to stay in their home? Like, it just is so mind-boggling because it's so common sense. It's not anything they would ever think of doing to a homeowner, and it just is so strange that this is not the law already. So I think you're running up against a lot of ingrained anti-renter bias, and yeah, all of that is really conspires to make it very hard to do political change that's necessary.
And I just add that because I totally agree with everything you just said. And I also think that if you can bring data to these legislators and specifically drive it home that these are your constituents, these are your people that are being impacted like this and having these kinds of health outcomes, because you guys are tying this into health, which is super important. And the more that people understand the long-term consequences and costs to society as a whole for these kinds of outcomes, that it's sort of, it's so clear what the right answer is once the picture is painted clearly. So I think data is another really strong tool.
I just also want to throw out one legislator that we got on our side recently had a daughter who was going through a no-fault eviction. So it was interesting that it took that kind of personalization for him to be like, oh, this makes sense and we should pass Just Cause. But again, it shouldn't take having that kind of personal connection for someone to see the justice of this issue. So that was good in this moment, but obviously we can't count on that. But again, like there's stories about this like this in every single ward in our city. And so the more the more we can tie it to the ward specific thing, like that's how we're kind of doing a lot of our organizing.
I wanted to offer something that's a little bit more speculative, which is and also just to sort of say that I'm a homeowner in McKinley Park, and I feel like a lot of this comes, obviously a lot of the problems we're talking about circulate around the fact that housing is a market, right? It's like a business apparatus, and I know that in addition to that, a lot of people who are maybe themselves coming from like precarious backgrounds or and end up being able to buy a home or something to that effect. The home kind of becomes the future, right? It becomes the investment or the savings account or the thing that maybe they feel like they can pass on to their kids or so forth, so on and so forth. For me, that's true. I don't have kids, but in terms of like, I am an artist. I didn't have retirement. This is how I like sort of circled that square or whatever. I was like, how do I like, I don't have anything to say, but how do I, how do I make this work? And I'm taking a long time to arrive at the point, but what I mean to say is that I think there's a lot of incentive for people to kind of behave really with a scarcity mindset around their property values. And so I wonder about to get public officials, especially like in our neighborhood, our alderman is very pro-developer. He's very like pro-business, not a super community guy. So how do we, one way I could imagine that we could sort of work with our aldermen would be around applying pressure as homeowners, right? Like as this like, and sort of somehow organizing in a way amongst people who aren't necessarily in need of these measures, but might be the sort of go-to like antagonists of these types of measures based on like how the sort of system works. And so I'm curious what folks think of that idea, or if they know of any sort of way in which there are, I guess what I'm sort of talking about is a little bit of like a solidarity economy, but like transposed onto like the housing market. So.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. All right, so we can go on to another question. And so this, it was once again, it was a little bit touched on before, and I think you can take this in many different ways. But it's really about like what fundamentally needs to change in our society to prevent evictions and housing instability. And this is, of course, a very broad question. So I encourage you to take it however you like. Once again, I'll put it in the chat so you have it. So again, what fundamentally needs to change in our society to prevent evictions or even just eradicate them completely, and housing instability?
Well, I'm going to take the crack at it because like you say, it's a big question. And there's this little narrow part of my brain that says, well, it's just about money. But there's a lot of pieces to it. And I think that Annie is at the crux of Just Cause. Annie also mentioned in response to one of the questions in the chat, the Lift the Ban Coalition, the ceiling measures, the legal pieces that can go into place to help make evicting people a little more challenging, less just walk in and kind of file some paperwork and get an eviction. But it does come down to money. I think we have realized now that if you put a lot of forces together, you can get rental assistance in place to help a lot of people and prevent a lot of eviction, especially if you put it in place in the right time in the process. There are many, I think, pieces that can be put together to sort of advance affordable housing, advance options for subsidized housing. I think we just need to make this a priority, like we've seen it come to the surface over this, pandemic, and seeing how having unstable housing is not something that our society as a whole really can sustain. So we just put all of these forces together, and hopefully, because I don't know of another bigger way to fix this. Because it would be great if we could enforce the fundamental human right of everyone to live in secure, stable housing, and extract it from the capitalist system that we live in, the monetized housing. I'm not sure that my brain's big enough to figure out how to do that part of it, but if we take some of these other measures and put them in place, I think it would go a long way to minimizing some of the I mean, it's not impossible to fix. It just takes the effort and I think just prioritizing and making the financial commitment as a society to housing. That's what I think.
Go ahead, Latham, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think I think it's interesting to think about, this is a conversation about housing and public health. And I think, one of the things that kind of comes to mind, which is also a sticky one, I don't have a roadmap for how we fix it or change it, but is just the cultural shift that needs to kind of happen in this country to feel that we all have a collective responsibility to one another. And I think that is, that I don't know how we do that, but I know that I think we all have a little piece to play, right, in that cultural shift, and hopefully it makes a difference.
I think that being in the United States, which is such a wealthy country, but also just really does not meet almost any of its citizens' basic needs, I think it's really hard to sometimes feel like I have the imagination to to kind of envision the worlds that we need. So I think sometimes I like looking elsewhere for examples of how we can do this. And so very recently, I don't know if folks have seen what has happened in Berlin, but voters there recently voted to basically expropriate large landlords of their properties and redo them as social housing. And that's great. Like, that's just so good. That is so cool. And I know that we're not anywhere near that in the United States, of course, but to be reminded that that is happening somewhere else on this planet is, to me as a housing organizer, sometimes I'm like, I really wish I could just move to Berlin and organize in that climate, but at least knowing that we have the model and that it's out there is really helpful. I think more fundamentally, I think I already said this too, I think seeing both renters and the unhoused as members of the community is something that I think many homeowners are guilty of not doing. There have been public meetings that my partner went to a public meeting, and there was someone there who called themselves a tenantist, as in they were discriminating against renters because they don't view them as part of the community. When a lot of renters were at a meeting to discuss downzoning and housing costs are a lot more impactful to a renter who's going to see their rent go up and doesn't have control over that versus a homeowner who might see their property taxes go up, but not their mortgage. So these are just some of the things I think that, that's just a bigger ideological shift of viewing housing first and foremost as shelter, as a place to center oneself and to come back, and not as a commodity. I think one other final sort of policy thing that I would love to see more of is vacancy taxes, and then even maybe more than vacancy taxes, again, taking over properties, because we know that housing units are being built. We know that they're more often nowadays in cities like Chicago in expensive properties that are then being left unused, all at the same time as we have people that are living on the streets or doubled up. So why is the market so skewed as to be building empty housing that's not being used? I would certainly love to see those units getting used tomorrow. I think that legally that would be a very challenging process, but I think we should be pushing for that more consistently.
just to add on to what everyone else is saying, I think before kind of all that happens, we should think about, or we need to keep in mind that the housing crisis and the way that we treat unhoused people it's a political choice. It's rooted in racist and capitalist policies. And I would say I guess from an organizer perspective, while policy is like, I'm all for it, it's an important part to get to where we want to be. I would encourage everybody to not wait around until your alderman decides one day that he is in support of all these wonderful policies and starts to care about people in his community. I would say organize with people you don't know, organize with people who are actually dealing with these issues, and start to meet people where they're at, like Sandy said earlier. I think that's an important place to begin as well.
I also wanted to add really quickly, I don't have the solution either, unfortunately, but what I will say is that, especially when dealing with landlords, a lot of it is just, education that's missing. Once they actually get to know our youth and our tenants and find out that they're actually wonderful people, they change their minds. They're actually willing to rent to other youth when I present another tenant. So, and I know that gets exhausting because it's not my job to educate you, right? And check you on your racism and things that, whatever baggage you have. It's not my job, but it is my job to advocate for my youth and young adults that need housing. So I will do whatever I have to. I will make phone calls to any landlord management company to try to educate them on, what really is our program and what our goal is to end the cycle of homelessness, right? And that these are actually human beings just like you and me, and they have the right to housing. So a lot of times it's just about educating them. So even with landlords, it takes a lot of work, to get them to finally trust our youth and trust that their apartment is in good hands. But that's the work that we've had to do, and engaging with them and engaging with, just property managers and telling them, hey, this is a basic human right. They need housing. So working with them too.
That's a really good point. And when we've got subsidies and we've got money that can come to the landlord, that is a huge benefit. So we should really advocate for subsidized housing, really get more of those vouchers out there for people and help make it a win-win situation. Because I think that's what you're pointing out. This can be a win-win situation. I'd love to see more money go to small landlords who need help, maintaining or improving their properties. We say, hey, you've got mold, remediate it right now. And maybe the landlord is living in the building and they're just kind of on a shoestring. It would be great if we could take some of all of these resources and put them towards improving and bettering housing for everybody.
Yeah. And I'll say just this panel right here, everyone's doing amazing work. So, don't give up, you're doing it for, good reason, good cause. So, we are a voice together, we're more powerful, coming together. So, we're doing this for a reason.
Absolutely, Sandy. Thank you for saying that. And then Aileen, one of the things you mentioned reminded me that I'd recently I had an email exchange with somebody in the neighborhood who has done quite a bit of work volunteering their labor skills to help people do repairs and things like that. And so there are ways that, the mutual aid groups and other neighborhood groups could, help with some of that work while we don't have the necessary systems in place to support people that own buildings, right? Because a lot of folks who own buildings, they probably live in the building too, right? Or they, or it's they only own the one. Not everyone is, slumlord. But so I think that could be a role for mutual aid groups to kind of get better at, is like how to help people make some of those repairs and share that burden.
All right, thank you, everyone. I think you touched on a lot of these. The next question I had just right before we switch over to answering some of the audience questions, but just any like parting thoughts about like the ways that people can, like actions and people can take now to combat the threat of evictions and the negative effects of they have on public health. I know we talked about just cause, we talked about organizing. Is anything else you all would like to maybe share?
If it's okay, I would love to plug Just Cause again, because we are really in the thick of it right now. Yeah, so as I mentioned, a lot of the work that we're doing is very much in the behind the scenes with like legislators that we're trying to get over to our side. I think at the same time, though, we need to make sure that they keep hearing from their constituents about these issues. There is a lot to do just in terms of like reaching out to aldermanic offices. And we've hosted phone banks. We're probably going to have more phone banks as well in the near future to basically call into some of the keywords that we need to get a special pressure onto those alder people. And so, like I said, we have our petition. I'll put that in the link in the chat again. If you sign on to that, you'll get a lot of emails from me, not a lot, but the right amount of emails from me, kind of sharing more information about things. We're really hoping to get this bill into City Council and voted on in next month's sessions. That is the goal. So I do think things will move quickly here. And if this is something that you care about and you think is valuable, I will be happy to talk more about things after. I can also put my email in the chat to discuss things further.
And I'm just going to put a few phone numbers in the chat just in case you guys know of people that are experiencing housing instability right now. The CCLAD number, it's the Cook County Legal Aid Housing and Debt Helpline. And I'm also going to include the website. It's rentrelief.com for the All Chicago Rent Program, rent assistance program. There's more rental assistance programs, and I get tangled up with all of them. I get a little bit overwhelmed, like I'm sure all of you guys do. But there are rent assistance programs, and you can always call 311. So I'm just going to put those, Henry, in the chat if that's acceptable. There's more resources, and if anybody does find that they need something, please reach out to me.
I wanted to borrow something from another political project that I'm involved in, which is called Make Yourself Useful, and it's a group of mostly white folks, and our main goal is to kind of understand better how we can actively engage in racial justice work. And a lot of what that work kind of centers on is having conversations with other white folks about racial justice. And so I think in the well, one, that's just like a good thing to think about, but also in terms of like, what can we all do? It's like, well, we probably are either know people that own property, or we rent from people that own property. Do we have relationships with those folks? Can we have a conversation with people about these issues? Maybe you can be like, oh, I went to this great panel, and they talked about this, and this was really interesting, and did you know this was and start to have those conversations, especially with folks that might have the ability to evict or not evict people. That could be very helpful. And then I love the resource sharing that's happening in the chat. And so, yeah, I'm certainly noting all of these things, and we'll share them as needed.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So I'm just I collected some questions in the chat. Some of them are quicker than others. And I'm just going to go through some of those, and then we can open it up just in case anyone else wants to ask any questions. You're welcome to unmute yourself. So we had a question: can tenants do anything to try and slow down the raising of rent prices? And I think
so not right now, not until we pass with the ban. Illinois has a rent a law in the state of Illinois that says that nobody can impose rent restrictions on owners. So landlords can increase rent, and there really is not anything to prohibit landlords from raising rent and to any amount they want, as long as you're not currently in the middle of a lease term. That's the only time you have a protection from increases in rent.
Stephanie, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's any way to put this nicely, but I would say that white rich folks, stop moving into Black and brown neighborhoods, please, because that, those types of tenants are displacing people and raising rent prices significantly. So just one idea, throwing that out there.
Thanks, Stephanie. The next question I have is another one, Aileen, probably this is best for you as well, is when is sealing or unsealing automatic?
So it's supposed to be automatic when the case is filed right now. And that is going to expire unless it's extended in August of next year. But as post-moratorium sort of, or not post-pandemic sort of response, if that's even a thing post-pandemic, I guess it's not yet. But there is not an automatic sealing mechanism other than the fact that the cases come in sealed. Now, when do they get unsealed? That's a little bit unclear to me. I think that if a landlord or if someone brings a motion to the judge will unseal the record. I think in some instances, the judge can do it on their own if there's an eviction order entered. But there isn't anything automatic about sealing or unsealing at this point. But so there was some automatic sealing being done for cases that were filed after the passage after the moratorium began, after the pandemic began last year. There's sort of this period of time where cases became sealed all of a sudden, but it was a very small little finite world of cases. Anything that is an old case that is still yet unsealed you can ask to have it sealed, and it depending on the circumstances will be sealed. If that's not clear, please let me know.
Thanks, Aileen. Next question we had was, have any jurisdictions implemented any rules that make it harder to evict families with young children? Does anyone know of anything?
So there's something called family status protection in fair housing, which means that you cannot evict someone simply because they have small children. So there are fair housing protections against and prohibitions against filing cases against people simply because of their family status, how many children they have. There are occupancy standards that landlords are required to adhere to, but as long as that's not a violation, fair housing protections will protect tenants from being evicted simply because of their family status.
That wasn't exactly the question, though. It was really more affirmatively that if you were going to evict, a whole bunch of people, and some of them have young children, is there anywhere where they will actually protect a person from eviction because of the very negative effects on eviction for small children?
Unfortunately, there really isn't a class of persons who are specifically exempted from an eviction. If the legal basis is there to file an eviction, unfortunately, there aren't exempted classes of people who would, for instance, to take your example, children are negatively impacted by living this experience. There are also people that may be that their life, their health is going to be impacted severely because they're going to be displaced or they're going to be removed from the unit into the streets, and it's December or it's January. There really isn't anything to stop that except for the discretion of the sheriffs right? That once the eviction is entered, the judge can't say, I'm not going to evict this person just because they have particular vulnerabilities. They would hopefully try to accommodate and help social services get in place, but there's very little that you can do to stop that. But the sheriff does have a social services division. And if there are critical questions of health and well-being, at least I think they do try to address that and help bring the person to shelter. Is that more what you meant? Ann?
Yeah, that's what I meant. I just wondered if anywhere in the US had put in anything that gave some preferential protections to families with very young.
I'm sorry that I don't know that answer, because now you're talking about the whole United States, and that I can't answer. I can only talk about what I know, and that is Chicago and Illinois. Sorry, and I know of nothing.
Marjorie, would you like to ask your question yourself, or you want me to read it off?
No, I can ask it. Thanks so much. So recognizing that this panel is organized by a group at UIC, and I see a lot of UIC folks on the call and folks who are affiliated with academia, I'm wondering what academics or academic affiliated folks could do to support the work that you all are doing.
I have a thought, which is it came up earlier. I can't remember who was speaking, but the idea around data, and one of the things that I put in the chat was about messaging, and I think that a lot of I think it was, we were talking about talking with our elected officials, that data can be really convincing, and that, obviously the data is on our side. And I think that's something that academics have a really strong relationship to, is studies and reports and things like that. And I think compiling those into something legible, and maybe if you could team up with somebody in the design or in the art department or whatever, that could help circulate this sort of information. I think that is one thing that is really helpful, that academics could have a lot of access to, is information.
And I'll chime in really quickly, but there was Chapin Hall through U of C some years ago. There was no data for youth homelessness until Chapin Hall came out with the Voices of Youth Count report. That actually gave a little bit more solid data that providers such as the Harbour and all over the nation were actually able to use for grants specifically. So I'll encourage anyone, that's on board for gathering any data of some sort, reaching out to organizations. Sometimes we don't have the capacity, the manpower to do that. So I think we would welcome anyone that would like to do a study specifically on homelessness.
I think the eviction courts could also definitely see more scrutiny in terms of research. Just as an example, we're kind of estimating the number of no-fault evictions based on some of the research that LCBH has done of the court system. But we're not 100% sure how many are actually no-fault eviction. And it really wouldn't take much more than a decent, sort of sample survey of some of the eviction cases to get a more accurate sense of that. I think LCBH does a lot of incredible data work, including having the eviction data portal, which is why we're able to talk about this in the first place. But I think that academic partners could very easily, and I think LCBH is very open to talking about that data with more people. So I think anybody who's interested in looking at the eviction court process can definitely dig more into that. There's also been good reporting. I know that while she's not with the Reader anymore, Maya Duke-Masova has written a lot of good stuff about the eviction court process in Chicago. So I would love to see more of that, because I want to have more of that data in my toolkit as I'm kind of having conversations with people. But I would like to know how many no-fault displacements are happening each year for sure. So we keep saying about 10,000, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's a lot higher. And I think that research could probably figure that out.
I had one other thing to offer, which is just that, you know, a lot of colleges and universities are gentrifiers themselves. And so, but are very keen to like be, you know, on good terms with their students, right? So students actually hold, in my experience, they actually hold a lot of power in terms of directing the policy of schools. And UIC, like UFC, has like a pretty bad track record. I don't know where things are at in terms of how it's developing or, you know, trying to develop particular areas. But I think this is a role that academics definitely need to step up and play.
I completely agree, Latham. I know that the UIC has been doing some work around racial justice, but and that's in both two departments that I'm involved in, both urban planning and public health. But we have yet to see what the actual results of that will be, and we've been pushing pretty hard against the university to make some measurable changes. Yeah. So Stephanie, do you have a question? So Annie said, do you have a question specifically for Annie you wanted to ask before we finish?
Yeah, sorry, real quick. I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about how, if the Just Cause policy has any protections for undocumented folks that are renting, or folks who don't have formal leases.
That's a really good question, because you're right. A lot of the leases in Chicago are month to month. And so that definitely is a situation that is rife with potential abuses. And yes, also undocumented folks. I know that a large part of why the illegal eviction crisis is so acute in those communities is because of the fear of, well, you know, landlords using the threat of calling ICE, that sort of thing. I think the part of what the bill would include is when an eviction notice is filed, they have to put the reason why they're filing an eviction on the notice. So I think that what you see a lot now with these sort of really bad no-fault evictions are just really shoddy notices. If tenants had more legal protection and had lawyers that they could go to in the first place, you would have a lot more protection. And tools like Rentervention are really good as a sort of like baseline starting point. But because the landlord will now have to put a little bit more into the actual like document that they're going to hand to a tenant, that alone will help, I think, in a lot of these situations. I still think that there needs to be a lot more sort of public education work done. I think especially like a campaign for folks that are undocumented would be really valuable, because I think that you could pass this law and some news would get out about it. But if you didn't see something about it and then you're undocumented and you still get this kind of notice, it could still be really daunting. So I definitely want to make sure that that is something that, as Just Cause is rolled out, when we get it passed, that we can be more conscious of that. So thank you for bringing that question up.
And I just want to interject one other thing, that there is an Illinois Immigrant Protection Act. So it is illegal to threaten to evict someone, or to call ICE, or to do any kind of threats or manipulation or harassment of a tenant based on their perceived or actual documentation status. So please, that is a fair housing violation. And it is also a defense to an eviction case. That's one of the reasons that an eviction case is filed.
Thanks, Eileen. Would you mind if I emailed you later so you can share that specific statute with me? Because we've had some experiences with landlords in our neighborhoods.
I'm going to put it in the chat too.
All right. So I'm just gonna wrap things up. We are almost at 8 o'clock. We're about to go probably a little bit over. I apologize for that, but I just want to say thank you all so much again for this incredibly informative and important discussion. I just want to say I'm super grateful to each of our panelists and to all of you who attended. I just want to give the panelists a quick little round of Zoom applause. I will put my hands, you can do little emojis, but I really appreciate you all. And now I just want to make sure you all give yourselves, the attendees, a round of applause for attending this event on a Monday evening. I know it's getting kind of late. I appreciate all of you for being here, especially those of you who are in school. I know we're all kind of struggling to finish out the semester. So if you are interested in getting involved with Radical Public Health, we can put our contact information in the chat again, as well as you can just look us up on the UIC's website. The recording, transcript, and slides will be shared with those who registered after the event, and you can feel free to share with your networks. And also, I think at some point it will be posted to our YouTube channel. And then one last thing before you all leave, I'm going to have a fellow representative, Molly, talk about the super important post survey with you. But thank you so much, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much again for attending. This was really informative for me from a social worker side. I'm an MSW, and it's interesting to hear it from a public health sort of point of view. But I just wanted to make sure you guys knew about our post survey. When you guys signed up for the Zoom, we had that pre-test candidacy, how much you guys knew about the subject, and we would love to know how much you learned. So please, please, please fill out this survey. It will give us great data on how to better the panels in the future, as well as give us a feel of how well we did during the panel. So thank you guys again.
And without further ado, that is the end of our panel. Thank you all so much again. Have a great night.
Thank
Thanks,
you for
everybody.
having us. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.